It's the end of a long day, and it's gorgeous outside, and we're in a windowless room. So if that doesn't say inspiration, I don't know what does. With all that said, thank you for being willing to spend this hour with me or so. How many of you have heard the word pedagogy before? What does it mean? Yeah. Okay, so it can mean the structure for teaching. What it actually means, literally, is the way of leading the child. So yeah, it's the same thing. So pedagogy is how we learn. So when you hear the word education, what are the ideas that pop in your mind? You can go ahead and shout them out. Like, what are the images, the one-word ideas? Education, what's it mean? Okay, school, classrooms, information, learning. What else? Where does it happen? In a classroom, right? What sorts of things does education look like? Tests, lectures, presentations, right? Okay.
Hands-on.
What's that?
Hands-on.
Hands-on, maybe. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so when we think about education, we have a very specific way of imagining this. If you ever get a chance, Ken Robinson, who has the best TED Talk of all time, speaks really succinctly about education. What he essentially says is, the way in which we think about education is a very industrialized approach. We kind of go, education happens indoors, and what happens outdoors is not education, right? So, I have to go learn something now, and that happens in a certain environment. I'm speaking to you, and therefore I'm the subject matter expert because I'm standing up and I have the clicker, and you're sitting down, therefore I'm smarter than you. You know what I'm talking about? David Orr, the renowned environmentalist and scholar, actually calls the architecture of buildings crystallized pedagogy. He says that when we're in a classroom, inherently, the moment I walk down in front, I'm smarter just by sheer virtue that there's a center of the classroom. So this is one specific pedagogy. The way of leading the child is whoever's in front is smart. They have the answers. You hand me a quiz or a test, and I tell you whether you are right or wrong, right? I get to tell you those things. Now, what's interesting about this is when we think about what education is, there's a different way of imagining it. There's a different way of thinking about it. There's actually lots of different ways of thinking about it. So what I want to talk about today is something called pedagogy of place. And Brett finished up talking a little bit about what's called placemaking. So pedagogy of place is also referred to as place-based education, experiential education, community education. Have any of you ever heard those terms before? Okay. So what those terms are essentially about is saying, how do we begin by learning first in the particularities of a place? So Wendell Berry, who I will reference 3 times at least, if not more in this presentation, is one of the most renowned kind of authors and speakers, more author than speaker, on this topic. And he has this to say. He wrote an article entitled The Futility of Global Thinking, which I want to get to in a second. He says, our understandable wish to preserve the planet must somehow be reduced to the scale of our competence. That is, to the wish to preserve all of its humble households and neighborhoods. Okay, so our understandable wish to preserve the planet. What he essentially says is, when we talk about environmentalism, when we talk about problems in the world, whatever they may be, often it's on a planetary scale, right? How many of you have ever heard or said to someone else, we have to save the planet, right? And then have you ever gone to see the Grand Canyon and realize that the Grand Canyon doesn't actually give a damn whether you save her or not? She's doing just fine. Does that make sense? So we think on this really, really large scale as if we can change these things. And he says, but really, I'm a pretty intelligent guy, but that's about akin to walking into the library, right? Just down the street, the public library, and going in and going, all right, learn it. Just read the books, right? When you think about the earth and all of its different biomes and its different cultures and set of social norms and climatological realities, it's this vast expanse. And the notion that we can somehow save it is a very interesting one. Often when I think about everything from deforestation, aquifer depletion, ozone destruction, soil erosion, loss of species, all of these things, right? I can't do anything about all of those things. What I can understand is the place in which I live. So Wendell Berry speaks furthermore in this essay about soil erosion. Soil erosion is a non-point source issue. It's happening all over the world. Monocultures and traditional agricultural practices devastate the loss of maybe the most complex ecosystems that we have, which are soil. And he says, and here's the thing, that can't be managed on a global scale, but it can be managed on your scale. So what he's getting at here is what's called placemaking, pedagogy of place. So I want to explain a little bit about some of the specifics of what this is. So when you think about learning, when you think about knowledge, some of you said information and content and knowledge and tests, those sorts of things. One of the things that I think is really interesting, I have a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, and if I want to force them or compel them into doing something, that means I'm working against their will. It means I'm working against kind of what they want to do. What I find is that when they are inspired, nobody has to tell you to do things, right? So all of you have something that you're interested in, right? Something that makes you tick, something that you think about when you are not doing anything that you have to do. You have arguably a sense of wonder about that thing. Nobody has to tell you, hey, when you go to Lake Michigan and it's the most beautiful sunset and you're with the people you love, enjoy that moment. Nobody has to tell you that, right? You just do. You begin with a sense of wonder. And you go, something about me connects to something that's happening here. Do you know what I'm talking about? When you go into the park and you have a picnic with friends, nobody else has to say, hey, just enjoy this moment. You just naturally, instinctively enjoy that. So what's interesting about pedagogy of place is it doesn't say, hey, you have to learn the facts and the content. It says begin with just curiosity about the place that you're in. Because what grows out of curiosity is the beginning and the nascence of information. So we move from wonder to knowledge and understanding, and then we start to have responsibility about a particularity in a place, right? So if someone else says, hey, save the planet because it's your responsibility to save the planet, and you go, okay, I know there's all sorts of things I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to bike, and I got to recycle, and I need to have a building that fits these requirements, and I know I'm not supposed to do that, but I am supposed to do that, and it's too hard, and I'm supposed to like not eat meat on Mondays. And do you know what I'm talking about? The checklist approach to justice, and it really doesn't work because most of us end up going, you know, I know a lot about sustainable food systems. So people always assume that I only have eaten, like, you know, I just have the most pure system that's ever been imagined. And I'm addicted to Oreos. I love Oreos so much. The good news about Oreos is they're vegan because there's no actual milk products in them, which is horrible. But I think the checklist approach to environmentalism that we often have, or even the checklist approach to diversity and inclusion that we have. Do you know what I'm talking about? Of like, make sure I say these things and do these things and build these things and approach it this way. That's really, really hard. Well, what actually emerges better in place-based education is start with this place, and once you start to have love for it, then you have responsibility. Then caring comes, and then action is actually the last thing that happens. You start to ask, well, if I care about this place and these people and this story and this history, how do I engage with this place? It's ownership. So as opposed to the notion that we can save the melting ice caps, and don't get me wrong, I'm interested in climate change. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But we kind of have to begin with what is happening in this place, because often I think we miss the things that are literally within a walk away from our own home to try and fix something that's on the other side of the world that we'll never interact with. That's really unfortunate to me. I teach a class in environmental studies at Grand Valley, and last week I took the students for a walk in the Arboretum. The Arboretum is literally 300 feet away from where our class is. Half the students had never been in there, which is fine. They're freshmen and sophomores. But their assignment for the day was just go walk around. Don't talk to each other, just be. Just be in this place. That's it. What was interesting is how we were like, oh, that was actually really peaceful. I enjoyed that. I want to do more of that. And again, I did nothing in that, but they were invited to just be, to have a sense of wonder, a sense of awe, a sense of curiosity. I saw some of the students walking around and picking at things and scraping them the same way my 5 or 10-year-old would. And in all honesty, I think that's because all of us have a natural sense of wonder or curiosity, but some of that gets stifled out because we're told you have to know the things, that education is what happens here, right? That it's a cerebral exercise. So education kind of begins literally where you are. Now, on the scale of it, there was an article written in response to Wendell Berry's article, said essentially, okay, yes, what you're saying is true, but we still need to be thinking on a global scale because the challenge is we live in a globalized era, right? If you have ever read the book, The Global Travels of the T-Shirt, I think, you find that almost everything we touch and taste and consume didn't come from close by. So it's really complex to talk about a localized economy when all of the clothes that all of us are wearing touched some other country before getting here, right? But I think that the difference is one begins with thinking out there, the globalized context, and one begins with looking here. So these are kind of the concentric circles of place-based education, beginning first at home, right? Home, what is happening in this place? And some of the questions that Brett was asking about energy and indoor environmental air quality and exchange and food and all those sorts of things can happen at home, but instead of being informed by outside ideas, they can be informed by even paying attention, right? So if you want to understand thermodynamics, pay attention to your own home. It's not that complicated. I was fortunate, by the way, for those of you, if you're interested, I do have background in building and I worked in sustainability and architecture for a few years, so I at least know some of the language about it. But what's really interesting is that your home and even your place, I like to think not just about your home being the physical building, but how you engage with the property. You don't need someone to tell you that the average American spends 90% of their time indoors because you already know it. You already know it because it's how you live, right? You move from building to car to building, and then you're outside for just a brief blip of time, then you have to go back inside to get educated some more. Does that make sense? Yes, I'm a little tongue-in-cheek, you'll forgive me. But you begin with your home, and then you move into your neighborhood. So if you've ever studied New Urbanism, or even the LEED Neighborhood Development Program, you can look at what you can touch within a few-minute walk is really powerful. And how much of the time do we not take enough ownership of the flora and fauna particular to our region, but we're wanting to address global crises, right? So what Pedagogy at Play says is start where you begin and move out from there. Not abandoning that there's, of course, a global and a national context to what we do, but that it's made up of your decisions in your place and not about trying to come up with globalized solutions. So Paul Hawken, really brilliant author, he wrote a book called The Ecology of Commerce that was kind of one of the first books to really start questioning the neoliberal economic enterprise. And I heard him speak, but he has a quote in one of my favorite farming books that I love. So I took the liberty of changing a word because it's a farming book, so I hope he'll forgive me. The word society actually was agriculture, but you'll go with it. So he says, if the problems of modern society are centralization, simplification, and biological reductionism, then the answers include diversity, complexity, and local knowledge. So you guys might be too young, but you've heard the term globalization before, right? Okay, so somebody tell me, like, what does globalization mean? And I'm not going to tell you right or wrong, just anybody. Bueller. Anybody? Okay, so if you've heard it before, you know that globalization is kind of the fact that decisions can happen on a globalized scale now, right? That Taco Bell can be in 100 countries around the world. And commodification is really what has made globalization possible, okay? So commodification is this word that comes both out of economics and manufacturing that means you break things down to their constituent parts so that they can be easily replaced, right? So a crop like corn is a commodified crop. So it doesn't matter if the ear of corn, assuming it's not for food purposes, was grown in Nebraska or Ohio or Wisconsin. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing. There's no connection to place, right? Information, when it can travel in a globalized context, means it doesn't really matter whether the person lived in Portland or Shanghai or Albuquerque or wherever, right? Globalization changes the way in which we interact with the world. And one of the things is that often we go, wow, we live in a globalized economy where things are moving back and forth all the time. But then we acknowledge the problems that have stemmed from that centralization of decision making. What Hawken is saying is that decisions have to happen on a local scale. So it's not about not the push points of the global scale, but that they've been centralized and simplified. Biological reductionism. Ronald Reagan, who's not exactly an environmentalist, famously said about the sequoias, if you've seen one sequoia, you've seen them all. And what he was saying is, what does the sequoia matter to us? And if I can reduce it biologically down to something that I can extract some benefit from, that's all I need. What he missed out on is that all of the other myriad of benefits that, if you ever get to walk amongst the sequoias, you will awe in your life and you will be filled with wonder. Well, he was going, no, that doesn't matter. What matters is how we can think about it. And there's a way in which we can think about the world that's very different, but it's diverse and complex and locally oriented. So to get into a little bit more about the restorative design element, have any of you seen this graphic before? Maybe? No? Okay. So Bill Reed was an architect, and he started this thing called the Regenesis Group. And I first saw this when I was working in an architecture firm, I guess maybe 8-9 years ago. And this is what Brett got at. That we talk about, okay, so we have more energy is required on the x-axis. The x-axis is the amount of energy required, and the y-axis is whether it's a degenerative system or a regenerative system. So when we think about nearly everything that, I don't know if this has a laser pointer. Oh, yes. So important now. When we look at conventional practice, and I would say conventional practice is not just how we design buildings, by the way. It's how we kind of live our lives. It's agriculture, it's education, it's economics, it's politics, it's entertainment, it's all the major spheres. It's industry in general. Some would say that we live in kind of an industrialized age where nearly everything that we do is just one step better than breaking the law. So think about this, for instance. I was thinking about what Brett said. I was walking here and I'd looked at my daughter's booster seat. She's 5, so she has to be in a booster seat until she's 8. And she's required by law to be in a booster seat. You can't make a booster seat out of anything that's a locally oriented material, which means it's required to be built out of petro, right? So it's really interesting that we actually have codified into our laws lots and lots and lots of ways in which we're not allowed to be thinking locally or oriented locally. We can have exchanges on a local basis, but by and large, most of the goods and materials that we use are built out of the globalized system. And these are degenerative systems, but this is what we are, one step better than breaking the law, right? So this building, we know that the moment we put up every single new building, we are going to be extracting and consuming invaluable, non-renewable resources. No matter how good it is, even if it's net positive, still all the heavy metals and all the materials that are embodied in the renewables are still going to require it more, right? So we have conventional practice. Green, which is all this is all the stuff Brett was just talking about, LEED, Green Building Tool, Green Globes, the HERS are kind of going, hey, this is bad, so let's do a little bit less bad. It's still really destructive and long-term isn't going to be durable, but it makes us feel really good because we're up here and everybody else is down here. The hard part is it's still not restorative. It's still not regenerative. What McDonough gets up here, Cradle to Cradle Design, if you've ever had a chance to read that or watch Bill McDonough's TED Talk, he's a fascinating human being, he has a lot to say. But sustainable, and I don't really love that word anymore, despite the fact that I have literally a master's degree in sustainability. But it just means, okay, let's just maintain how we're doing things. Well, if you've noticed, how we're doing things is not working in lots of ways. And I'm not just talking about energy in the grid. I'm talking about look at it from someone who's never visited planet Earth, visiting planet Earth. Well, there's war and famine and starvation and disease, and the people that have the most resources are not very happy or healthy, and they're not enjoying life, and there's racial relationships that are absolutely horrible. A lot of that seems to me like, oh, and we want to sustain that? That doesn't work for me. So then we have to start to ask questions of what does design look like that's beyond that? And this is where we get into restorative and regenerative systems, where we start thinking of Lewis Mumford, who's a famous historian, said, all thinking worthy of the name must be ecological. When you think about that, that's actually a really harsh quote. It's saying any thinking that is not ecologically based is not actually thinking, by the way, is what he's saying. But he does it in a poet's way to not make you realize that he's insulting you while you're reading it. Pedagogy of place, by the way, to think about it, if I can put it in simple terms for you, when we talk about education, again, I have daughters in school, they have tests, reading, writing, arithmetic, right? These are the things. My daughter has to take MAP tests and MEP tests and all the time to gauge whether or not she's learning. No one ever asks the question, is she a kind human being? That's not what education is about. Education is about the knowledge that's crammed in her head. Does that make sense? Now, thankfully, she goes to a Montessori school, and so there's some really beautiful things that happen there. But place-based education goes, you have to know why something, not just the thing itself, right? So how many of you have ever had something taught to you and you found yourself going, when am I going to need to use this, right? I'm going to let you in on a secret. A lot of it you're not going to use because it's not about content. It's about knowing how to engage the world. And when you know how to engage the world, then the content comes as freely as you need it. Once you exist from that place of wonder, when you want to, any of you ever had it where you get excited about something and you want to read books, you want to watch movies about it because you're excited about it? No one's telling you that you have to do that, right? So pedagogy of place says, what's happening in the culture of a place, in the ecology of a place, right? Those are the first questions we should be asking. Not what is somebody determining that education should or should not be from a centralized authority a really long ways away. And that's the disparity between these two. In order to start getting into regenerative systems, though, we have to see ourselves as part and parcel of environmental systems. So how many of you have ever said or heard people say, I am an environmentalist? Have you ever heard that? Okay. I've always found that to be funny. One, I used to say it, so that's why it's funny. But two, because you don't get to choose. You don't get to choose. If you breathe and respire and consume, you are part of the earth. There is no difference between us and the earth. Sometimes we just tell ourselves that there's somehow disparity. Woody Allen, I'll give you a Woody Allen quote because that always helps, famously said, well, nature and I are two. That's quite a bit of hubris and naivety on his part. What's interesting about regenerative systems is that we see ourselves as co-participants. We are part of the system. So it's not a question of whether or not we want to exist with the earth, it's how we want to exist with the earth. The answers we seek are neither global nor comprehensive, nor are they a technological fix to biological and social problems. These solutions must simultaneously address wicked problems of justice, empowerment, democratized education, and ecological destruction. And for that, these solutions will be comprehensive, locally oriented, inclusive, restorative, and community owned. So now I'm going to talk about urban agriculture, because that's what this is a presentation on. So what's really funny is I ran a farm at Grand Valley for a few years. I started to get more and more involved in this world where I have a hard time talking to people about the environment, because I was doing that. I was doing lots of environmental lectures and talks and things like that. And then I sit in a hermetically sealed building all while begging to be spending time outdoors every day. So I kind of struggle with that. And through the process of that, I became something of a farmer. So I'm not a farmer in the true sense because I don't pay all of my bills by growing food, but most of them I do. But what's interesting about urban agriculture is that it's not about growing carrots. I love growing carrots, and I can talk for a really long time about just growing carrots. I'm not kidding. Like, if anybody says the word right now, that's all we're talking about for the rest of the time. But I want to talk about these 3 different organizations and what they're doing. So last year I got the chance to visit an organization called Growing Home in Chicago. Anybody ever heard of Growing Home? Yeah, have you really? It's fantastic. So they're in the Englewood community. They're in the south side of Chicago. And if you've ever paid attention, not many good things are said about the south side of Chicago. It's a poor and depressed area. It's formerly highly industrialized. It's predominantly ethnic minorities, which means Black and Latino. And there's a high rate of individuals that were formerly incarcerated. So there's this area that was parking lot, literally. And someone ridiculous said, well, how'd that happen? That doesn't have to be parking lot. That can be something else. And so they started an urban farm there. And it's 2 acres, and every year they train 40 individuals who were formerly incarcerated in an apprenticeship program. Now, what's interesting about incarceration, if you have ever studied the issues of reentry at all, is that prisoner reentry, generally they can't find jobs. Jobs are a really, really big challenge for a couple of reasons. One, because a person is just trying to figure out how to get back in life. But secondly, someone says, I don't want to trust you with X amount of machinery or equipment or responsibility. Well, one of the first things that I love about agriculture is it's inherently vulnerable. It's exposed. There aren't corner offices and walls and places to hide behind. It's just this vulnerable thing. It's kind of a great equalizer in a lot of ways, because you can have a CEO and a formerly incarcerated individual, and they are both just human beings who need the soil and need food. So Growing Home, their kind of tagline is plant, learn, work, transform, grow. Really, really amazing work. It's community owned. It's nested in the community. And they're distributing around 150,000 pounds of organic produce to a neighborhood that is in a food desert every year. With people from the neighborhood by the neighborhood, for the neighborhood. That's not just about growing carrots, that's about growing community. And that's taking the problems of globalization and going, okay, what could be a local solution? Because us asking for money or jobs or something that's globalized is not necessarily helping, right? The philanthropic arm isn't going to be enough. So what could we do? D-Town Farms is another organization in Detroit. So you've probably heard about some of the urban agriculture in Detroit, and there's two different models of urban agriculture in Detroit. There are some that are happening by very, very wealthy developers that are buying up land, but there are some like D-Town Farm where it is people that live in the community that literally went, we don't have food, we don't have work, and there's nothing but blighted homes. Let's do something beautiful. Let's do something ridiculously beautiful. Their tagline is healthy food, healthy planet, healthy people. And what I love about that is they don't forget the global kind of ramifications of the work they're doing, but they understand the scale of which it matters, right? I can't feed someone on the other side of the world. I don't know how. I can hardly wrap my head around that. But I can work with my neighbor to take care of them, right? We can take care of each other. And as they're no longer commodified as just a person that I see, but they become a person in whom I invest and we invest in each other, right? Agriculture can do that because it brings us all to the actual frailty that we have, which is as human beings, you need to eat and I need to eat, and you need water and I need water, and you need friends and family and I need friends and family. That's pretty equalizing. Growing power in Milwaukee, Will Allen was a former NBA player who moved back to Milwaukee. It was a food desert, really depressed area. Again, all three of these areas, pretty economically depressed areas. Not places that you would think about for cool environmental work, but here's the thing. They're doing environmental, social, and economic work all at the same time in really beautiful ways. They now produce, I could be wrong, but I think it's about 1 million pounds of food a year on 3 acres of land in a formerly industrialized area. They host over 5,000 visitors a year, and they're working, I think, in 7 different cities, helping to establish urban agriculture projects. Will Allen, who has received the MacArthur Genius Grant, says some of these kids that are getting, Adderall for their ADD or ADHD, they just haven't touched the soil yet because soil is indeed a drug. In fact, Wendell Berry, again, talks about the drug. And here's the thing. They just released a study from Stanford. They're actually finding it's true. When we literally touch the soil with our hands and feet, it helps release endorphins. It's actually quite good for us. So what these organizations are doing, yes, they're growing food, but they're growing community. So I want to talk about what is urban agriculture. Because I've been studying urban agriculture for a number of years, and like many of you, maybe when I first thought, I was like, oh, that's really cool, right? Like that was about the extent to which I could imagine it. Like that's really cool, like that's a creative use of land or something like that. And then I started getting into it and discovering that urban agriculture literally is every one of these. It's economic development. It's creating opportunities for experiential education and immersive pedagogy in the places that people live. It's empowerment. It's justice where there are food deserts or food apartheid, where people don't have access to food. It activates previously unutilized spaces and is very welcoming and inclusive. In fact, part of the Living Building Challenge that Brett talked about, one of the required imperatives is urban agriculture. By the way, one of the things I've been trying to talk to the International Living Futures Institute is if they had a more comprehensive urban agriculture program, they would start to realize that everything from stormwater to site to renewable materials can come from growing. See, when we think about agriculture, generally we think about food, but the way in which we get our food, fuel, and fiber is all through agriculture. So if we start to see ourselves not as distant, not as separate from the land, but completely indebted to it and in communion with it, it really changes how we think about having a garden in our neighborhood. It's no longer just a cool thing. It's literally the sustenance of life. And when I think about this was us working last year with an organization that tore up part of their parking lot to put in a garden. I have one goal in life, to tear up as many parking lots as I can to see them put into gardens. That's it. Because that space that was at the corner of a parking lot was commodified in every sense of the word. Someone pulls in, they park their vehicle. Literally, I started thinking there are little spaces of the land that no one would have ever touched, ever. It's just a parking lot. Parking lots are passive areas. Last year, we worked with 11 students who had some really amazing experiences. We produced a ton of food that was donated to HQ, which is the local runaway and youth homeless youth shelter. It had an incredible experience. And by the way, to look at an ecological perspective, whether it be urban heat island effect, stormwater capture, carbon sequestration, a number of other environmental metrics were addressed by that process. But more importantly, it was just a beautiful thing to do. It was inspiring to be a part of. So now I want to talk one more time about what I think the invitation is for us. At the beginning of one of his books on culture and agriculture, The Unsettling of America, Wendell Berry talks about a twofold approach we generally have to environmentalism. Nope, that's not it. Well, we're going to get there. Okay. Let's fill it all in. Wow. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So he talks, the first way is abuse, right? We all know this narrative pretty well. Mountaintop removal, deforestation, aquifer depletion, violence, genocide, war, factory farming, monocultures. I think the mantra, no pain, no gain, is a really fascinating one to capture this. The way we think about gain is we kind of just beat the hell out of stuff, right? Whether it be ourselves or the people that we know or the earth. We treat them the same. It's through this kind of lens of abuse, right? So when you think about, if you've ever watched factory farming happening, right? How many of you have ever seen a video of factory farming and gone, okay, that's not right? You know what I'm talking about? The reason why is because it creates cognitive dissonance because it's incredibly violent in nature. Just everything about it is violent. And I'm not just talking about the slaughter. I'm talking about taking an individual being, a sentient being that has experiences and emotions and going, your experiences and emotions don't happen. You are just raw material to be commodified. So the one way in which we engage with nature is, and I would say when I say nature, I mean ourselves, other people, and the earth. All of it is one of abuse. The next way we engage is through what Wendell Berry calls the terrarium view of ecology. Save the earth, save the children, save the polar bears, do your part, leave nothing but footsteps. Just protect, conserve, don't touch it, right? So I always have found this fascinating because to be an environmentalist means that I do lots of I reduce things, I reduce my consumption. Does that make sense? I reduce how much energy I'm using. I use less of something, but I'm not actually in communion with the thing yet. So we have abuse, which is where this abuse is where we get all of our stuff, right? All of our stuff, right here. We're sitting in a building that is heated and cooled and lit, largely in part, and will be for a long time in relationship to abuse. And again, I'm not just talking about global climate change. There's lots of different ways. The save and protect realm is afforded by the abuse, okay? And that means abuse of people, historically marginalized populations, the planet, and ourselves. What Wendell Berry says is there a third way? Is there a different way? He says, yeah, it's called engaging, right? So if abuse is aggressive and saving and protect is passive, he says there's a way of being assertively involved. And I love this Chief Seattle quote. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. What's really interesting about agriculture is that I would say it's maybe the most visceral way in which we can literally engage with the earth, right? Where we go, oh my word, what it takes for me to keep breathing, which is oxygen, right? And then I need water in my system, and I need food in my system. Well, I know that were it not for trees and plants and vegetation and all sorts of those things that are out there, that I wouldn't be able to live. So really to say thank you to things that are out there, like when I first learned about environmentalism, I'd see this kind of picture of you've got the picture of the earth with the recycling logo around it or something, like save the planet sort of thing. Pedagogy of place kind of says, I have gratitude to express to this particular place. Were it not for Lake Michigan, none of us would probably have water today because that's where all the water that it fills most of our homes and buildings comes from. Same thing with our food. While we may have a globally commodified system of food distribution, if it were not for the earth, I wouldn't have food to eat. And so pedagogy of place is, let's take those realities that we already know about what happens outside in the world and bring it here, because that's all we can actually do. And I think urban agriculture is a really powerful tool for starting to do that. Because it's not just reducing, right? It's not just save and protect of, hey, you're doing bad things, do fewer bad things. That's kind of disappointing for me, right? Like, hey, everything you have ever done is bad, so just do less of it and then live with that reality. I don't know about you, I want to sink my teeth into something good and redemptive and restorative. And so when I think about agriculture and these practices of restoration and redemption, I go, that's something that I can get into a little bit more. A closing thought, and then I'll open it up for a couple questions if you guys have time. David Orr, again, says in Ecological Literacy, by the way, this was recently attributed to the Dalai Lama. It's not, it's David Orr. The plain fact is that the planet does not need more successful people, but it desperately needs more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of every kind. It needs people who live well in their places. It needs people of moral courage willing to join the fight to make the world habitable and humane. And these qualities have little to do with success as we have defined it. This is a friend of mine, Joel. And Joel and his co-worker Lance started New City Urban Farm, which is an urban farm that's close to here. There's some dear friends and colleagues of mine. Every summer, they work with youth from around the neighborhood. What's really funny is a couple years ago, my friend Lance applied for a grant to get a greenhouse. And it was, why are you going to get a greenhouse? Because he could talk about wanting to produce more local food, to cut back on, 1,500 food miles per, the average food or whatever. But he said, here's why. He said, because I've got this student who's bored, who wants something to do. But if I don't have something for him to do, he makes bad choices because there's not a whole lot of good things in the neighborhood. So if I get a greenhouse, I'll be able to keep him out of juvenile delinquency more. And sure enough, he wasn't in juvenile delinquency anymore after he was able to work with Lance a couple years. Really powerful story. So what's interesting is I think sometimes we want singular solutions. We want a solution to this over here, and this over here, and this over here. And with all the wicked problems that we face, we have to start thinking about comprehensive solutions. And I don't think that necessarily happens at the policy or the globalized level. I think that begins kind of in this particular place. So with that, thank you. Appreciate it. And I think I've got a few more minutes, but no, I think it's like 4:20. But if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them at all. If not, that's okay too. What's that? I literally covered everything. You have no questions again. I'm also happy to tell you a little bit more about what I do. So I run a small organization called Urban Roots. We are starting an urban farm. I've been farming in the city for a few years, and we're going to be moving into the southeast side of Grand Rapids, or have. We're going to be doing a partnership with Bethany Christian Services and some of their refugee youth. So we're really, really excited about that, and we're going to be doing a CSA. And we'll be doing a series of workshops and events, so if you're interested in getting involved, you can check us out and learn more. So there's my spiel. Sir.
So you talk about the pedagogy of place in regards to education. So do you see this as about working with schools more?
That is a great question. So we actually were awarded a tiny, tiny little grant. And in fact, Mayor Bliss is doing some really cool stuff for the city of Grand Rapids. Just received a small grant through, I forget the organization, but it's one of 7 cities to help students at schools connect more with natural systems. In lots of ways. So we're going to be working this year with a couple of GRPS schools. In fact, we're working with one that is called Covenant School. And Covenant is a non-traditional school for kids that have kind of can't make it anymore in the regular school. And we're going to be putting in a garden there. So we're really, really excited to be addressing, because, by the way, just from a pedagogical perspective, literally there's not one topic. Economics, thermodynamics, chemistry, biology, botany, anthropology that you can't teach through food systems. So we're trying to. And I go and do talks like this sometimes to school kids. So, but I think, quick to answer that question, what we need is more teachers and more administrators that recognize students are not clients or widgets to be shuffled through a system. They are human beings, and they will shape the rest of the world. And we desperately need more storytellers and lovers and healers. And we don't need more kids to score well on tests. That's all right. Stepping officially off my soapbox, maybe. You had a question back there. Yeah. No, no, I love that. So that's a great question. I love that you feel comfortable to be like, hey, the stuff you said, that's not helpful to me. So, um, so a couple thoughts. So there's a book called Biophilic Design, which came out of E.O. Wilson's School of Biophilia. Stephen Kellert, who I think does architecture at Yale, I think it's Kellert. Biophilic Design is a fantastic resource, and biophilia, one of the reasons it was so kind of profound to me, started to go, hey, comes from the two Greek words, bios and phileo, like you already love nature. Whether you think you do or you don't, you already love her. So I think looking at that in terms of some of the strategies of saying how do people and systems connect in really kind of beautiful ways. As far as, I will say the Living Building Challenge is doing some really cool stuff. One of my big critiques of the Living Building Challenge is that often it is a very wealthy, expensive system, which means those that have money and resources can do fancy pants, healthy architecture, but everyone else gets kind of just boxes. So I think there's a lot to be done. I think one of the things we have to do is shift our thinking about architecture to think about building places. And so what is included in places? I was at a permaculture farm in Nicaragua for all of February. Well, of course, shelter and buildings are part of that, right? Like you're going to have the built environment because, so I was a builder for a long time, and literally this week I'm building greenhouses, I'm building a grow room germination chamber, I'm building all these sorts of things. So I think still thinking about building and design being a part of it, but thinking how does that part of placemaking? So I've been wanting to say to the Living Building Challenge, stop calling it the Living Building Challenge and start calling it the Living Place Challenge, because we're not building buildings, we're building places. So that's just a thought. But Biophilic Design, Living Building Challenge. Also, Jason McLennan, who founded the Living Building Challenge, has a book called The Philosophy of Sustainable Design. Really good stuff. Hopefully that's a start. A couple answers. Sir?
Have you dealt with any of the, I want to say, the closed cycle of food farming, fish, and like
The aquaponic systems.
the cleaning water and everything? So
Yeah. So growing power. You can see, actually you can't see it here, but yeah, all of these right here are their aquaponic systems. So aquaponics, I haven't done them yet. We're talking about doing one at our new location eventually. So if those of you who aren't familiar, aquaponics is a closed loop system. Hydroponics, which is just growing in water, is very energy and input intensive. Generally, it's just a different sort of monoculture, but instead of growing corn, you're growing high dollar lettuce. Aquaponics is kind of going, how do ecosystems work? Ecosystems work because flora and fauna are interacting, and biotic and abiotic materials are moving consistently throughout the systems. And an aquaponic system, you have fish eating food, producing waste, and that waste, by the way, the most common organic fertilizer is literally ground up fish. They're very high in nitrogen. That fish waste is then used to feed the plants. Couple challenges with the aquaponic system. Often it's hard to source the food for the fish that is actually from local sources. Because one of the things we find is that when we start getting into it, nature is just so much more eloquent and articulate than we are. So we kind of try and model a system in our basements with aquaponics, but she's doing it much better in rivers and lakes and streams. However, I have a good friend that's doing some aquaponic systems, and I think on a small scale, and and we talk in the permaculture community about a transitional ethos of if we have this thing over here that's bad, and we know we want to get to here, but we can't, what are some things we can do along the interim? And I think aquaponics fit in there really well as a really great transitional system. So there's a place called The Plant in Chicago that I got to visit, and they have a huge aquaponic system. They have like 3 of those blow-up pools full of shrimp in a basement of a former meatpacking plant. So if you ever get a chance, The Plant's worth checking out. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Go and enjoy the rest of your day.